Welcome to our Russian World Cultural Program. Today we will explore the rich heritage of Russian history. You are probably wondering why we have included a history lesson as a part of our cultural program. Well, you ask such good questions. We have included a history lesson as a part of our Russian World Cultural video, so as a result of viewing it, you will be able to answer two questions. Does history help to shape culture, or does culture make history? We will discuss four areas of Russian history: the origins of Russia, Imperial Russia, Soviet Russia, and Renaissance Russia. I have invited four friends to assist us in our journey back in time. I'd like to introduce them to you now. Cyril, from the origins of Russia, Catherine the Great, from Imperial Russia, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, from Soviet Russia, and Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin, from Renaissance Russia. Let us begin.
Hi, my name is Cyril. I'm your tour guide for the origins of Russia because of the unique role that I play in Russian history. It is also my job to unlock the doors of mystery as it relates to the part of Russian history that is not often talked about or is not well known. Who are the Russians? It is important to note that the area we call Russia today was first inhabited by a long succession of people and cultures. The Slav tribes were primarily influenced by the Scythians, the Greeks, and by their Scandinavian neighbors. The Greek colonials were sophisticated, educated, and cultured. The Scythians were illiterate and barbarous, despite being among the world's most skilled horsemen. The Vikings were half pirates and half merchantmen. No neighbors could have differed more from one another. Does Russia belong to Europe or Asia? This is the dispute historians have had for years. Some held that Russia had more landmass in Asia, so Russia belonged to Asia. Some held that since Russia's major cities and political structure existed nearest to Europe, Russia belonged to Europe. Some held that Russia is a part of both. Physically, Russia is so vast that it does lie on two continents, Europe and Asia. Today, the Ural Mountains form the boundary between European Russia and Asian Russia. Even more, Russian culture over the years has been shaped by influences stemming from European and Asian worlds. But it is interesting that many Russians think of themselves as a unique Eurasian people who somehow belong to neither Europe nor Asia. When was the Russian state founded? The original Russian state was founded in the 9th century, around the year 862. This would mean that Russia was founded about 600 years before Columbus landed in America. At this time in history, Slavic people lived in and around two communities, Novgorod and Kiev. Both of these towns lay along a chain of rivers and lakes that reached from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, forming a rich trade route. According to the Russian Primary Chronicle, edited in the early 12th century, three Scandinavian brothers, Rurik, Sinus, and Truvor, came with their followers to the land of Rus in 860. They were called Varangians, or Vikings, and they originated in Scandinavia. They came as a response to an invitation from the people of Novgorod. Our whole land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us. So the Varangian brother, Prince Rurik, became celebrated as the original founder of the main princely line. Another Varangian prince, Oleg, established his capital at Kiev, becoming the first independent ruler of Kievan Rus in 882. What was the most important event in the emergence of early Russia? By far, the most important event in the emergence of early Russia was the adoption of Christianity as the official state religion. How did Christianity come to be the official state religion? In 988, Grand Prince Vladimir of Kiev decided that though he was wise and prudent, he and his country had no religion. So Vladimir sought counsel among his nobles and elders, who advised him to send 10 good and wise men to go see for themselves how each faith was practiced. In Constantinople, when they were taken to the huge cathedral of Hagia Sophia, with its interior completely decorated with mosaics of pure gold shimmering in the light of 10,000 candles, they were spellbound. We knew not whether we were in heaven or earth, and we are at a loss to describe it. We only knew that God dwells there among men, and their service is fairer than the ceremonies of nations, for we cannot forget their beauty. Shortly after that, in 988, Vladimir was baptized, made Christianity the official religion, and decreed that henceforth the Kievan land would adopt Christianity. As a result, the faith and culture of Eastern Orthodox Christianity replaced the pagan idols of Kiev. The Russians embraced the Eastern Christianity joyfully, with all the exuberance of their nature. What made the adoption of Christianity so important to the development of Russian culture? There are several reasons why the adoption of Christianity was so important. The first reason why it is so important is that the conversion to Christianity brought literacy to Russia. You see, before this time, there was no written language. The people communicated their Slavic language orally. Creating a written language would enable Christian missionaries to convert the people to Christianity. This is where I come in. The modern Cyrillic alphabet of 32 letters owes its name to Saint Cyril, that's me, and my brother, Saint Methodius. We both were the first to translate biblical texts into a Slavic dialect. My brother and I adapted Greek and Roman letters to the sounds of the Slavic language and created letters for unique sounds. The original alphabet was devised primarily to write down the liturgy and Bible teachings. This language became known as Old Church Slavonic. The second reason why the adoption of Christianity was so important is it was significant to the development of architecture. Cathedrals and churches quickly became the landmark of all Russian principalities, towns, and villages. In the earliest Russian churches, the domes were rounded, like those of Byzantine churches, but quickly they took on their distinctive onion bulb shape. Russia had yet another building tradition. This method involved building structures in wood. This is a picture of the Transfiguration Church, 1714, at Kiji. Built without nails, from wood hewn, only with an axe, this magnificent church on a remote island has onion domes. Its jagged shape is often compared to that of a fir tree. The third reason why the adoption of Christianity was so important was the development of the art and icon paintings. The word icon means image or likeness. Almost without exception, icons are unsigned. The name inscribed on the icon is that of the saint depicted. The peasants in Russia turned to icons as silent listeners for consolation. Icons were treated with great reverence and were handed down generation to generation because they were witnesses to all of a family's joys and sorrows. Those who could not read or write understood the language of old Russian art. People read the Gospels. Instead of language of the printed word, one read the language of colors. Christian art is a symbolic art. It shows that God has become visible. His image and that of each saint offers insight into the invisible and divine reality of the holy. Icon paintings stress the frontality of the figures, bringing the figure in a direct relationship with the viewer. Andrei Rublev was considered the greatest of all icon painters. Here we see icon paintings by Andrei Rublev. The adoption of Christianity also influenced the development of bell music into Russian society. Russians loved bells. From the 10th century on, Russians marked their days by the various pealing of bells. By the 16th century, bells were considered sacred instruments. How did Russia grow to be a great prosperous nation of Kiev, Novgorod, and Moscow? The Kievan kingdom, which so creatively took on the Christianity of Byzantium, was ruled from the city of Kiev. The Kievans were prosperous traders, taking honey, amber, wax, and furs down the meandering rivers to Constantinople, from which they returned with silks and objects of art. Kiev in the 10th and 11th centuries was one of the wealthiest and most animated cities of Europe, larger than Paris, who at the time had 80,000 inhabitants and twice as large as the small city of London. Although the greatest, Kiev was not the only important city of early Russia. In the north stood the city-state of Novgorod. It was the heart of a huge trading empire, which at its height stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Ural Mountains. The prosperous Novgorod merchants traveled both in Europe and Asia. Citizens in Novgorod developed a distinctive architectural style. It is they who are often credited with designing the first onion-shaped dome. Along with the development of Kiev and Novgorod came the development of a new city. Moscow was founded in 1147 as a military outpost in a region called Muscovy. It was close to several rivers, which gave it access to the Volga River and the Caspian Sea. Moscow was gradually becoming the most powerful city in Russia. But while Russia was growing and developing a culture of its own, the Mongols had their conquering eye on the Russian state. The Mongols, later known as Tartars, who were from Asia, began invading Russia in 1237. The Mongols captured town after town. Finally, in 1240, they stormed the city of Kiev, destroyed it completely, and killed almost all of its inhabitants. Even the city of Moscow was burned 6 times. The Mongols ruled Russia for the next 250 years. They chose not to rule Russia directly, but allowed Russian princes to manage the day-to-day affairs, providing them with opportunity to pay taxes, custom duties, fees, and tolls to the Great Khan. How did the Mongols' Tartar invasion influence history and culture? Under the Mongols' rule, thousands of words found their way into the Russian language, and most importantly, Russians accepted the Mongols' way of government, which demanded obedience to one man. One such man was Grand Prince Ivan III. In 1480, he refused to pay taxes to the Mongols, and the Mongols' domination of the Russians ended. What was Ivan III's contribution to Russian history? In 1485, Ivan III had the Kremlin built in Moscow to help prevent further Tatar-Mongol attacks. Kremlin means fortress. Later, Tsars expanded and improved the Kremlin many times, erecting palaces, churches, and governmental buildings. Ivan III gathered Russian princes and their lands, assumed authority over the Russian Orthodox Church, and expanded Moscow's territory to include Novgorod. For these achievements, he was called Ivan the Great. Ivan III's grandson, Ivan IV, was the first ruler to be crowned not as a Grand Duke, but as a Tsar, or Emperor of all Russia. Tsar comes from the Latin Caesar. Ivan IV continued to broaden the empire. The Volog region south to the Caspian Sea came under Russian control, and the Russians began to move into Siberia. He made new laws that favored the people and improved trade and relations with European nations and with Turkey. Ivan IV is also known as Ivan the Terrible. After the death of his beloved wife, he led a reign of terror in which he murdered hundreds of princes and landowners. He seized their estates and distributed lands to his followers. In a fit of rage, he even killed his own son. The seized estates were worthless without the peasants to work them, so Ivan and the Tsars that followed him passed decrees which forbade the peasants to leave the estates on which they worked. The peasants were called serfs. Serfdom was a form of slavery. What happened during the time of trouble? After Ivan IV's death in 1584, a series of rulers quarreled over Russia's throne. This period was called the Time of Trouble. The Time of Trouble was marked by civil war, famine, and invasion. This turmoil continued until 1613, when a council elected a noble named Mikhail Romanov as Tsar. This began the Romanov dynasty that would rule Russia for the next 300 years.
Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Sophia. However, many of you know me as Catherine the Great. I will accompany you as you journey through Imperial Russia. Let's start with my predecessor, Peter I, better known as Peter the Great. What fascinated Peter when he was a boy? At an early age, Peter became fascinated by the foreigners he met in Moscow's German quarter. They told him of Amsterdam, London, and Frankfurt, where Western Europeans were making huge strides forward in shipbuilding, printing, medicine, and armaments. Peter was eager to learn and use that learning to help his backward country. He traveled across Western Europe in disguise so that he could observe what life in the West was like for ordinary people. Why did Peter want to help to modernize Russia? Peter's major purpose was to westernize his backward country and to bring to the people the advantages of Western technology. In order to accomplish this, Peter traveled to the capitals of Western Europe and convinced many artisans, craftsmen, and technicians to return to Russia with him. In 1703, Peter moved the capital city from Moscow to a new city that he had ordered to be built. He named this city St. Petersburg after his patron saint. How did Peter the Great reform Russia? Peter implemented several important reforms which brought Russia into the modern age. Military reform, reform of the government, reform of economics, and of education. Peter pushed forward his military reforms first, because as soon as he returned home, he faced a war with the Swedish king, Charles XII. His greatest military reforms, however, were in the area of power. Beginning with one obsolete and leaky ship, he constructed a powerful modern fleet. A new textile industry was created that benefited from Peter's knowledge of Western technology. He also developed mining and metallurgy, a process of working with metals to purify them and shape them into objects, so that Russia was self-sufficient in arms. To finance his reforms, Peter established a head or soul tax on the peasantry. A great believer in education, Peter opened vocational schools as well as schools of mathematics, navigation, engineering, medicine, and artillery. He established a Russian Naval Academy and founded the Academy of Science. The Russian alphabet was simplified. Arabic numerals were introduced, newspapers in the Russian language were published, and education was made compulsory for children of the nobility. St. Petersburg was built by forced peasant labor. Many died constructing huge buildings on the swampy land. The city was also populated by force. All officials and members of nobility were ordered to build houses in St. Petersburg. Peter was selective in what he chose to introduce to Russia. His reforms were enjoyed by only the tiny percentage of the population in the upper class. His reforms caused the division between the peasants and the nobility to grow. The westernized upper classes saw the Russian peasantry as ignorant and superstitious. The peasants became known as the dark people. Nevertheless, for better or worse, Peter's Russia began the 18th century as a powerful new actor on the stage of world history. Who ruled Russia after Peter? It is an irony of history that Peter, the most masculine of rulers, was to be succeeded by a series of women. Catherine I, Peter's widow and second wife, after the rule of Peter II, Anna, the niece of Peter the Great, immediately followed by Elizabeth, Peter the Great's daughter, and after the short reign of Peter III, there was yours truly, Catherine II. The four empresses ruled for 2/3 of a century between them. What were Elizabeth's significant contributions to Russia? While Elizabeth ruled Russia, she opened the first public theaters and made operas and ballets very popular. She founded the first university in Moscow and the Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg, the new Summer Palace, Peterhof, the Cathedral of the Resurrection in the Smolny Convent, Tsarskoye Selo, Great Palace. I was a German princess who, at the age of 15, married Grand Prince Peter, later Tsar Peter III. I should say that I became one of Russia's most successful rulers. My reign was marked by spectacular success abroad, important internal reforms, and the consolidation of the social order. I continued westernizing Russia, the process begun by Peter the Great. Under my reign, Russia grew to be a major power in European politics. How did I reform Russia? Unlike Peter, I was more interested in ideas, culture, and education. I encouraged the development of medicine and scientific discoveries and established a legislative commission to write up Russian laws. I patronized artists and writers. I initiated the translation of a great body of European literature into Russian, and it was I who decreed the introduction of a modern system of general schools. I founded the famous Hermitage Museum of Foreign Art in St. Petersburg, which helped the public to appreciate both Western art and their own heritage. It was also during my reign that St. Petersburg became a city of breathtaking beauty and culture. Many architectural masterpieces were built at that time. The magnificent Winter Palace, the monument of the Bronze Horseman, the Pavlovsky Palace, Troitsky Cathedral of the Trinity, and many more. Why do people think that I was such a controversial figure in Russian history? I have to admit that just as Peter's reforms were enjoyed by only the members of the upper class, so too the vast majority of Russians were little affected by my interest in the enlightenment of culture and education. For the poor Russian serf, life remained as hard as it had always been, and even became worse. Many Russians questioned how long a society could survive in which a tiny group of wealthy nobles ruled millions for their own benefit. The ruling class held all the power and almost all the wealth. 19 out of 20 Russians were peasant serfs. Alexander II organized banks, built railroads, aided schools, and gave more freedom to the press. Even so, Alexander II is remembered for his role in freeing the serfs. For this reason, he was called the Tsar Liberator. Why did the emancipation of the serfs fail to improve the lives of the serfs? The freed serf remained desperately poor. To make matters worse, they had to pay for the land they farmed. What were the conditions in Russia which led to the revolution? The dramatic reforms of Alexander II were followed by the harshly conservative rule of Alexander III. The attitudes of Alexander III were largely shaped by the assassination of his reforming father. Alexander III became reactionary, bitterly opposing any concessions to the demand of further reform. When Alexander III died, his son, Nicholas II, became the next Tsar. By 1900, Russia could boast of over 2 million industrial workers, better known as the proletariat. Poorly paid and crowded into disease-infested slums, their death rate was the highest among industrial workers in the world. Although prohibited from organizing into unions to work for better conditions, they nevertheless went on strike with increasing frequency. On January 22, 1905, the workers of St. Petersburg decided to address Tsar Nicholas II about their needs. Unarmed, they assembled before the Tsar's winter palace. Before they could state their request, the Tsar's soldiers opened fire. Hundreds of workers were slaughtered. After this Bloody Sunday massacre, opposition against the Tsar grew. Racked by the growing pains of industrialization and the urgent call for political reform, Tsarist Russia blundered on into the jaws of World War I. World War I began in 1914. The Russian army suffered many casualties. In late February 1917, shortages of bread and coal led to demonstrations and riots in the frozen streets of Petrograd. Petrograd was the name given to the city during World War I because St. Petersburg sounded too German. When troops were sent to suppress the movement, they joined it instead. Nicholas II was forced to abdicate the throne. Thus ended the rule of the Romanovs. This episode is known as the February Revolution. The Romanov Tsars had ruled Russia for 300 years. While Russia experienced great territorial expansion, wealth and power. But now the Romanovs, born out of one time of trouble, were destroyed in the midst of another.